My German is pre-industrial and mostly religious.
Oh, judgment is nigh, for der Belschnickel ist I.
You know how they say some people were born to be bad? Well, I was born to be Belschnickel.
Americans love celebrating their roots, even if those roots come from ancestors generations or centuries ago. The St. Patrick's Day party for Irish Americans in New York City is legendary. In many aspects, it's kind of hard to tell where Italian-American heritage ends and Boston begins. Heck, we even visited a German Christkindlmarkt over the holidays while in Chicago. But if there's one surefire way to enrage a European, it's to say something like this.
Mother is half Norwegian, half Irish. And 23andMe had told me so.
Who is St. Patrick?
That's a great question.
No answer?
No.
All the Americans are over here. Oh my God, I love this. I love Ireland. They doing my.
So why is heritage so important to Americans? And why is this weird hyphenate of German American, Irish American, and Polish American so pervasive in the USA? But in other nations with similar migratory histories like Canada and Australia, not so much. Well, let's take a look. Alexis de Tocqueville marveled in 1840. You hardly meet an American who does not want to be connected a bit by his birth to the first settlers of the colonies. Yet despite that love for heritage and legacy, Americans still love being American. As both a nationality and an identity, for many it is both a point of pride and an invisible scarlet letter. For better or for worse, it defines us when we travel abroad. But what I've also found equally as interesting is just how much other cultures also play into the American history and American experience today. Around 75,000 people every year attend Germanfest in Milwaukee. The city of Chicago dyes an entire river green for St. Patrick's Day. And in North Carolina, a crowd of over 30,000 tartan-clad men and women flock together for their own Highland Games. Millions of US citizens can provide heartfelt and well-sourced accounts of their Swedish, German, Ukrainian, Dutch, Polish, Belarusian, Irish, Italian, or Scottish ancestries, sometimes down to the county or even village levels of granularity. Yet for the vast majority of them, their connection to that ancestry is often generations removed, and the vast majority of them don't actually speak the native language anymore. Don't believe me? Well, take a look at some of these numbers. The 2020 census results showed that nearly 45 million Americans self-identify as either German alone or in combination with another ancestry. Yet, in the United States, the German language has been on the decline for over a century, from over 2 million in 1910 to only about 1.1 million now. And full disclosure, my family fits squarely in that box. My family has always celebrated its German-American history. My grandfather, for example, despite being a third-generation American and only knew how to count to 10 and swear in German, although don't get me wrong, a very useful skill, he always preferred to have German shepherds on the farm and name them Heinrich, Max, and Fritz. Seriously. But again, this is something that I think is actually a truly uniquely made in America phenomenon. Other countries like Australia and Canada have a lot in common with the US. Both are similarly wealthy countries, spacious and migrant built. And yet, neither of those settler societies seem quite as prone to hyphenation or ancestor worship. And because I happen to mention Canada, I actually feel like this is a good point that I stop the video just for a second, because I'm sure these comments are coming. French Canadian really should not be considered on the same level as German American or Polish American, because that identity and that label specifically comes from a very different history. French Canadian is actually an exonym, a name given by the Anglophones to the French populations of the former French colony of Canada. These people only called themselves Canadians back then, and for many years had no idea that they were French Canadians, since there was no need to specify that this is how the term Canadian had to be interpreted because it was so obvious. But nowadays, it's mostly francophones outside of Quebec that use the term Canadiens Français, or it's Anglophones that use the term in English. It is rarely used in Quebec by the populations that this term is meant to call these days. In other words, French Canadians don't actually describe a group of immigrants who came to Canada. In fact, I think most French Canadians would say that they actually have a monopoly on the term Canadian. But that was very much not the case in the United States, where immigrants from other countries who came to the US who were not from England were given these hyphenated descriptions dating all the way back to the 17th century. There always existed a kind of hierarchy of otherness, which immigrants were more acceptable and therefore more respected in mainstream American culture. And naturally, when you experience otherness in a new land, it's common to congregate together in new neighborhoods, villages, and townships where people looked like you and spoke like you. We had Little Italy and Chinatown in New York. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for many, many years, the city actually had 3 newspapers, 2 of which were published in German. And I can't help but think that it's partially because of that hierarchy, as well as the need or want to gather together, that perpetuated this hyphenate distinction in American culture. And it's also why today, some people will reach across an ocean to figure out who they are, and spend thousands on online subscriptions and DNA tests in order to learn more. It's often said that genealogical research is the second most popular hobby in the United States, after gardening, and the second most popular search category online, after porn. Now, for sure, those claims should probably be taken with a grain of salt, but it is true that over 26 million Americans have taken genealogy DNA tests since 2012. And the genealogical behemoth Ancestry, which boasts more than 3 million subscribers and the nation's largest genetic database, was purchased for $4.7 billion in 2020. So perhaps then it's probably not surprising to most of you that of course it would be in the United States that the world's largest ancestry record depository is also found there. A mile into Utah's Little Cottonwood Canyon heading east from Salt Lake City, several concrete arches open into the face of a mountain, behind doors designed to withstand a nuclear strike, through tunnels blasted 600 feet into the rock, in a vault that's another 700 feet down, lies a trove stashed in steel cases. Not bullion or jewels, but microfilm. Millions of reels of it. They contain billions of images of genealogical documents, an estimated quarter of all vital records on Earth. And the collection is owned and operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and is again, the largest physical archive of ancestry in the world. And these kind of records go part and parcel with another new phenomenon, ancestry tourism, which has become a booming industry, along with things like skiing vacations or whale watching vacations. In 2019, an Airbnb survey found that the share of people traveling to quote unquote trace their roots worldwide had increased 500% since 2014. The governments of Germany and Scotland have websites devoted to heritage tourism. In Dublin, the Shelbourne Hotel's genealogy butler can research your Irish side, if you so please. And tracing our roots was something that Jonathan and I actually did a year and a half ago when we traveled to northern Germany. There really is something much more personal and deep than what's available to the typical tourist. Being able to trace down to the village or even the streets or heck house that our family once lived was an experience that was just unforgettable. And now, while I certainly can't speak for every American, when it comes to things like Ancestry, there was really one quote that really resonated with me. In his 2013 history of American genealogy, Family Trees, historian François Weil wrote, Family is, quote, refuge from the outside world in an ever-changing environment. It's easy to feel insignificant and listless in such a globalized world. But having a family to trace yourself back to, even if you really didn't know them personally, does help to ground you with the roots from where you've come from. And I don't think this has to be necessarily related to tracing yourself back to some king or fancy nobility. In fact, I think for a lot of Americans, tracing back your ancestry and celebrating that heritage is almost kind of a moral endeavor. A person could learn a lot from what his or her ancestors had done right or wrong. And reframed within the context of republicanism and democratic ideals, genealogical inquiry in a very real way is not just about celebrating the richest and most titled of our forebearers, but even the more humbler kind. And that's, to be honest, the kind of ancestral reckoning that I find extremely admirable. But listen, I also can fully get why maybe many Europeans see our American hyphenate tendencies to be a little bit cringy, right? Like calling myself German even though I'm not from Germany originally, I was not born here, is probably a little bit silly. American isn't a heritage in the same way that German, Irish, Polish, or Greek are. Unless, of course, you're Native American, but therein too lies a very important distinction. Don't get me wrong, the United States has done a decent job of creating its own distinct mainstream American culture. Despite how divided our politics might make us seem, we actually have a somewhat common ideal. We have our own sports and music and culture, and we have a somewhat common history. Even the parts of that history that aren't shared by all are still somehow made a part of our collective identity. And in a way, that's the whole idea of the melting pot. And in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, the idea of the melting pot was certainly a helpful and appealing visual metaphor for a more united society and therefore a stronger national identity. But in reality, the melting pot was simply code for assimilation. For the ingredients in a pot to really melt together, the contributing elements would have to shed their individual characteristics, and thus communicating that assimilation and eventual homogeny, in fact, become necessary. And this leaves no room for those who dare not assimilate. A fact that was made painfully clear by a statement from Theodore Roosevelt in 1915, where he said, "The men who do not become Americans and nothing else are hyphenated Americans, and there ought to be no room for them in this country." And this melting pot metaphor was used prescriptively to suggest newly arrived immigrants quickly and completely assimilate into American society, leaving behind cultural values or beliefs that might clash too greatly with standard American values. But I think that's also maybe why I find it extraordinarily fascinating that today, these hyphenates of German American, Polish American, Irish American, African American, that these heritages are actually celebrated, despite the push from some people in our country that still even up till today feel that newcomers need to leave behind their own cultures and adapt to this so-called quote-unquote American culture that, quite frankly, does not always absorb and certainly does not always honor elements of the cultures of those who join our society. Society goes back and forth between its preferences for which version of global fusion is preferable. And certainly, some hyphenates find it easier to coexist in American society than others. Many would certainly rightfully argue that trying to figure out where German American ends and just simply American begins in the Midwest specifically is almost an impossible task. But that's kind of just it. To be American means that you kind of have to do something that you don't necessarily have to do in other countries. You have to figure out how exactly you fit into being American. And that's something that even for those who are born inside the United States struggle with. Othering, racism, xenophobia, nativism, and discrimination are inherently related concepts that intersect and overlap and will therefore build upon or incorporate assumptions from one another. If you don't agree with mainstream American beliefs, you're missing one major component of that Americanism.
If you don't love America, get out.
If you come from one of the many groups that has been marginalized by that shared American history, whether it be because of your gender, class, ethnicity, skin color, or sexual orientation, it can be hard to see how you fit into America. And if you don't subscribe to the more mainstream American Christian religious canon, it can feel like you're not quite American.
You cannot separate God from politics. You can't take him out of our government.
So there's very much a part of me that finds this otherness that exists in this hyphenate identity to be somewhat refreshing, even if it isn't quite as authentic as that first-person experience as many Europeans would probably like us to have if we use that label. Consider the identity phrase Irish American. It certainly is a step away from a purely country of origins identity. I'm Irish. But at the same time, it's a far distinction from the identity statement, I'm American. Yet between those two poles lies more of an identity range that's commonly understood. And I think that the American identity is compatible with alternative identities. And it's in that mixture of identities within the United States that strengthens our nation rather than weakens it. And you know, quite frankly, at the end of the day, I would also wager that the big reason why many Americans just love to celebrate their heritage and identify as a particular group is also because it's also just sort of fun. Our modern media zeitgeist has cemented some of our favorite stories and characters within the context of hyphenate American heritage. One trip to Walt Disney's Epcot illustrates that even if it's not the real thing, it can still be a fun destination in its own right. And just like the fun of exploring cultures and customs at the World's Fair of past, today there are thousands of local festivals that take place across the country, from the Christkindlmarkt in Chicago to Mardi Gras in New Orleans or Bastille Day in Milwaukee, that celebrates heritage and cultures from around the world, often presented by immigrant families using ingredients and recipes brought with them from their own homeland, or passed down lovingly from generation to generation. You know, I grew up in Central Illinois, and one of my absolute favorite times of year was when it was the state fair. Yeah, I know, I'm a little country in that regard, but one of the best places to visit at the state fair in Springfield, Illinois is for sure the Village of Cultures. You can try food, listen to music, and see customs and traditions from around the world. And again, here it's also often prepared and presented by first-generation hyphenate Americans. My neighbors actually from down the street in my neighborhood were the ones who ran the Indian booth at the Village of Cultures for years and years, and their food was always one of the big highlights. And while Indian heritage was not my heritage, it was really lovely to connect with them over something that is so close to their identity, whether it was their food or their music. It was sort of made it seem like the world was a little bit of a smaller and friendlier place. And I got to know them as who they authentically feel, and through the foods that they authentically love. And I think that's something that we all could probably use a little bit more of these days. So yeah, while being Irish American certainly probably doesn't make you Irish, in the same way that my family being German American doesn't automatically make me German, although I will be applying for German citizenship later this year, I can definitely understand why this is such an important part of many families' identities. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you find the American proclivity to identify as German American, Irish American, Italian American to be annoying, or something that you actually find quite interesting? Yeah, if you're European in particular, because this is where I happen to live in Europe now, please let me know. But if you're American, I would also like to give you the opportunity to share a story, if you feel so inclined, about why you like identifying as this hyphenate. Are there customs, are there foods, are there traditions that you have in your family that still feels like this thread that weaves back through generations? And what is it that you really love about that so much? I think that could be a really fun thing to share, and I really look forward to reading the comments of this video. But as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, and for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!